there has been a lot said, written, and produced about the American Civil War. So this is going to be a relatively short video because I don't have tons to add, but I want to go over some of the highlights or lowlights, if you prefer, of this most deadliest conflict in U.S. history. I want to begin by actually talking about the most controversial modern topic of the war, arguably, which is what caused it. Traditionally, there have been two thoughts over the cause of the war. Usually historians who tended either to sympathize more with the South and or who tended to be more conservative politically argued that the war was about states' rights. Historians who sympathized more with the North and or who tended to be more liberal argued that it was because of slavery. Here's the thing. If it hadn't been for slavery, there probably would not have been an American Civil War. There were certainly other issues that states and regions disagreed about, but none of those issues were anywhere nearly as divisive as slavery. Slavery was divisive going back at least to the Constitutional Convention. So having said that, and when we talk about states' rights, as one of the supplementary videos I posted was one from Crash Course U.S. History, and you shouldn't cite Crash Course U.S. History because it's really designed for high school students primarily. But there's good content. I don't agree with all of the content, but one thing that host John Green pointed out was that his high school teacher, when he asked about states' rights, the response was, "What were the states interested in their state rights for?" And the answer there is essentially slavery. Now, states' rights does cover other things. So when someone says states' rights, although some on the left would argue that's always sort of a synonym or sort of like a hidden code for racism, I don't think that's true. But Civil War, if it hadn't been for slavery, there would not, in my opinion, have been a Civil War. However, the question has to be asked, why did the U.S. fight the Civil War? In other words, the South seceded because the South was afraid the federal government was going to abolish slavery. Why did the U.S. fight the war? Did the U.S. fight the war to abolish slavery? Here's where the answer gets more complicated and I think more interesting. For the first 2 years or so of the war, the stated purpose that Lincoln and other Union politicians said was that the war had nothing to do with slavery. And so, quite frankly, when historians say, oh, if you say that the war wasn't about slavery, you're wrong, you're racist, they are saying that Lincoln was racist, because that's exactly what he said for the first 2 years of the war. He said repeatedly that the war was about preserving the Union. I'm going to get back to this in a few minutes. So I want you to keep in mind that idea. So Lincoln is elected president. The Electoral College meets and he wins a majority of Electoral College votes. Even before he is inaugurated, on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina secedes from the Union. You might recall that we talked about the idea of nullification before in the course. And those nullification ideas were all coming from South Carolina. Because while slavery was prevalent throughout the South, it was especially prevalent in South Carolina. South Carolina had, by far, I believe, the highest percentage of enslaved peoples in its population. And so South Carolina told the federal army, you need to get out. And the commander of federal forces left one of his forts and went to Fort Sumter, which is in the harbor of Charleston, I believe, South Carolina, where he holed up for the next several months. They were running out of supplies. Lincoln said he was going to resupply them. South Carolina said, no, you're not. And on April 12th and 13th, the South Carolina militia, after more or less laying siege to that federal fort in Fort Sumter, opened fire on it. And the fort fired back. That is considered the beginning of the American Civil War. Now, Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th. Now, today the president is inaugurated in January. That actually required an amendment to the Constitution. The president used to be inaugurated in March because of issues with communication and transportation. It used to take longer to get from wherever the president might live to Washington, D.C., for example. And so winter weather making travel even worse, besides the poor conditions of traveling in general. So for the U.S. in the 18th and 19th centuries, the president was inaugurated in March as opposed to January when the president is currently inaugurated. And so that wasn't actually changed until 1937 when the 20th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. So by the time of Fort Sumter, by April 12th, 1861, not only South Carolina had seceded. Now, not all of the southern states seceded by this time, but besides South Carolina, basically all the states south of there seceded. Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas all seceded by the time of Fort Sumter. Lincoln is in a panic. Lincoln's primary purpose at this stage is to preserve the Union. Now, Lincoln was truly, passionately opposed to slavery. He was truly an abolitionist. The Republican Party was founded as essentially a one-issue party. It was founded as an abolition party. Lincoln fully supported abolition. That did not mean that Lincoln wasn't racist. He was a product of his age. And in fact, in his political speeches that we have, he said many racist things about African Americans. So keep in mind, as we've said multiple times in the course, just because a person was opposed to slavery did not mean that they wanted equal rights for all human beings. And interestingly, despite writings and speeches that occasionally were highly racist, Lincoln had a reputation as just the opposite in his life among people who knew that. Frederick Douglass, for example, who knew something about racism, said that of all the people he interacted with, Lincoln was the least sort of racially concerned of anyone that he knew. Or maybe at least of any white person that he knew. So that's very telling, but we shouldn't forget that by our standards, a lot of Lincoln's writing is racist. By his standards, the standards of the era, it wasn't per se. Maybe. Or maybe it was and Douglass was being polite. I don't know. Lincoln repeatedly said during these, both after he was elected and before he took office and after he took office, he essentially told the South, I will do anything you want to keep you in the Union. I will support a constitutional amendment that says that slavery will always be part of the U.S. Like, he was willing to do anything. He repeatedly told people he had no intention of unilaterally abolishing slavery. He was opposed to slavery. He thought slavery should end. He did not believe that he as president had power to end it. And he was willing to do anything to preserve the Union. And so for the first about 2 years of the war, that is the stated purpose of the war in the North. The war is to preserve the Union. It is definitely not to end slavery. So Lincoln becomes president officially on March 4th. That should be 1861. I apologize for that typo. Let me fix that. Congress doesn't reconvene for another 3 months until July. And so Lincoln essentially has to rule by executive order without input from the legislative branch until then. Today, presidents from both parties get in political trouble, like their opponents always get upset when they issue executive orders, and presidents Both Republicans and Democrats do this. And the other party says, oh my goodness, you are usurping, too much power. But as soon as they take office, they do the same thing. That is nothing new. So Lincoln rules by executive order. That's not particularly popular. After Fort Sumter, the other states that would officially become part of the Confederacy also seceded from the Union: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. And so we have here this map. And this map comes from Wikipedia, which is, again, don't cite Wikipedia in your writing. Don't use it as a source. It's good for background, and it is good for maybe some context here for pictures for this map. So what you see here are current states. So this is in 1863, approximately. Alaska was not part of the U.S. in 1863. It was part of Russia. Hawaii was an independent kingdom. The states in pink were states that were free states. The states in green are states that, and this is still not a the best. I could not find a great map. I need to make my own. The states in green were states that were part of the Confederacy. These particular states were what are called border states. You've probably heard that term before. The border states were specifically Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Delaware isn't always included in that list because it's not directly in the border, but it should be. These were states where slavery was widespread, but that remained in the Union. Now, in the case here of both Missouri and Kentucky, both the Union and the Confederacy claimed those states. But so the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, states where slavery was ongoing, but that were part of the Union. West Virginia becomes a state during this period in a move that is maybe not quite legal in terms of how states are supposed to be formed. Essentially, when Virginia voted to leave the Union, the counties of Western Virginia, where slavery was not widespread, said, we aren't going to leave. And they were admitted to the Union during the Civil War. Kansas, by the way, was admitted to the Union just before the Civil War in January of 1861. A couple of other things I should point out. One is Indian Territory, which says here it's disputed. A lot of maps I looked at to try to include completely got Indian Territory wrong. Indian Territory was essentially a Confederate territory during the Civil War. Remember that Indian Territory was initially settled forcibly by the so-called 5 civilized tribes who, at least for the most part, had slavery because they were from the Southeast and they were copying their white neighbors. And so although slavery existed amongst Native American people for millennia, the so-called civilized tribes had slavery of enslaved Africans just as their European neighbors did. And so Indian Territory was very much Confederate territory. In fact, this map says it in abbreviations under it, CSA, for Confederate States of America. Similarly, Arizona, New Mexico, although here it looks kind of like, oh, they're split, I believe we're much more Confederate territory. Although I'm not 100% sure there, I guess, because I'm not totally familiar with the history of the Southwest specifically. So be aware there's some issues with this map. But key things to keep in mind: the Union, the Confederacy, and then importantly, these border states. West Virginia is sometimes considered a border state also. Slavery was legal in West Virginia, although very few people in West Virginia had slaves. West Virginia is in Appalachia. It's highly mountainous. It is obviously not suited for plantation agriculture. So slavery was it was not widespread there at all. So Winfield Scott, who we met in the Mexican War, was initially one of the main Union generals. And his plan was called the Anaconda Plan. So an anaconda is a snake, right? That wraps itself around you. And so he was going to have a multi-part plan. He was going to blockade southern ports, like a naval blockade. He was going to take the Mississippi River, which runs approximately along here. This would cut the South in two. The western South, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Indian Territory, would be out of reach of the eastern South, the states east of the Mississippi. So this is divide and conquer. This was believed it would cause the South's economic collapse. The first major battle of the Civil War. So Fort Sumter is sort of considered the first battle, per se. It's the first shots. The first important battle was Bull Run, also called Manassas, in Virginia. No one thought the Civil War was going to last long. And so at Bull Run, it was almost like a party atmosphere for civilians. Like they, according to legend anyway, picnicked, getting ready to watch the battle. That went about as well as you would expect. It was McDowell on the Union side against Beauregard and Jackson on the Confederate side, and the Union just completely lost. And McDowell was quickly replaced by George McClellan. McClellan was also not particularly competent. Lincoln is a person who most Americans admire, and Lincoln had, I would agree, many good qualities. I don't know that Lincoln was a good commander-in-chief. Military history isn't my area of specialty, but my understanding is that Lincoln interfered a lot in the running of the Union Army, and he did not do a good job with that interference. It was, on the Union side, a comedy of errors in the early war. There were some important battles on the Western theater, and Western here is from the perspective of the 1860s. So West here means states like Tennessee and Mississippi, not states like Montana and Utah, which weren't states at the time. But important ones, Shiloh, which is in Tennessee, that's in 1862. This was a Union victory with heavy casualties. And then a very important Western battle. So Shiloh is actually a super important Western battle. It's a big Union victory. Even more so is the Battle of Vicksburg. Vicksburg was a fort that overlooked the Mississippi River. There was a lengthy siege that lasted for like a month and a half or so. Vicksburg surrendered, and this essentially made part of the Anaconda Plan come true. The Mississippi River was now controlled by the Union. It was a huge victory. Then there was the Peninsular Campaign. Peninsular here is referring in stuff in Virginia. This was an unsuccessful attempt by George McClellan to conquer the Confederate capital at Richmond. It did not work, so Lincoln replaced McClellan with Pope. Pope then lost the Battle of Second Bull Run, or Second Manassas, and so Lincoln reinstates McClellan. Then we have some of the most important battles of the war. Antietam is the bloodiest day of the Civil War. And Antietam was one of several battles where it involved Southern attempts to invade the North. And so Southern General Robert E. Lee attempts to invade Maryland, but the plans were found by Union soldiers. McClellan, though, held off on acting immediately. McClellan, one of his traits, which at times could be a good trait, but at times is not, is he was very, very cautious. The Battle of Antietam ended by 5:30 that day. There were over 3,600 people who died, and there were another 22,000 casualties. Those were people who were injured. This was 25% of Union troops and 31% of Confederate troops. This is the bloodiest day in American history. Now I say bloodiest here specifically because I'm talking about both people who died and people who were injured. There were days where there were more deaths, including days where those deaths were caused by natural causes like hurricanes or even diseases like the Spanish flu outbreak in the early 20th century. But when we look at these numbers, this is militarily by far the deadliest day. And even if we are comparing this with, for example, September 11th attacks, the number of dead is higher than the number of deaths as a result of September 11th. And again, this is a single day. There were multi-day battles in American history that resulted in more deaths and casualties in this, but as a single day in U.S. history, Antietam retains this very sad title. Lincoln was very mad that afterwards McClellan didn't pursue the Southern forces. He fired McClellan again, and he did not bring him back. He replaces him with Burnside. There, then attack Fredericksburg, but after the Confederacy had been able to fortify Fredericksburg, this was the largest number of fighters in any Civil War battle, with around 200,000, not quite, but nearly around 200,000. The Union lost badly. Twice as many casualties on the Union side than on the Confederate side. After Antietam, Lincoln writes the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, in September of 1862, the preliminary quote-unquote emancipation was made, and it stated essentially that it would only go into effect the next January if the Confederacy were still rebelling. If the Confederacy laid down their arms and rejoined the Union, the Emancipation Proclamation would not apply. Again, Lincoln's purpose is still to preserve the Union. But at the same time, Lincoln is realizing that the war is growing increasingly unpopular in the North. It's also increasingly unpopular internationally. Lots of European powers, including England, were questioning why the U.S. was trying to preserve a union when they themselves had revolted for independence. And from the British perspective, the Southerners, the Confederacy, was doing essentially the same thing. Lincoln deliberately shifts the focus for the war that has been now going on for over a year, longer than anyone expected. He wanted to give it a new moral justification, that now, rather than fighting to preserve the Union, the war would be fought to end slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution ended slavery with the exception of certain Indian reservations, or Indian nations. This was before reservations. Slavery was still legal amongst Indian nations because they were not subject to the Constitution. The U.S. government eventually had to sign treaties with Native American peoples who held slaves to end slavery in their nations. But for practical purposes, the 13th Amendment is what ended slavery in the U.S. The Emancipation Proclamation did not. The Emancipation Proclamation only applied to those areas that were in active rebellion against the U.S. In other words, parts of the Confederacy. The U.S. had no power there. The U.S. had no means to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. Specifically, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to the border states. It did not apply to Missouri or Kentucky or Maryland or Delaware or West Virginia. It only applied to southern states in active rebellion. By this point, there were parts of the South that the Union Army controlled. It didn't apply to those areas either. It was only parts of the South that were in what was called active rebellion, that were, in other words, not under Union control, that were part of the Confederacy. And then we have Gettysburg, the most famous battle of the Civil War, one of the most famous battles of American history, a multi-day battle. And Gettysburg is the turning point of the American Civil War. Let me say that again. Gettysburg is the turning point of the American Civil War. This was another attempt by Robert Lee to invade the North, just like he had earlier done at Antietam in Virginia and in Maryland, now in Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. The Union, in another very bloody multi-day battle, defeats the attempted invasion. It is the last time that the Confederate forces have enough forces to try to make an offensive against the North, at least in any meaningful way. It is the turning point. After victory, Meade is once more cautious. Now, I know you're not in Minnesota, but I have to talk about the 1st Minnesotan Infantry. So the 1st Minnesota Infantry was the first group of volunteers in the country after Fort Sumter. The governor of Minnesota became a state in 1858. Its governor, Alexander Ramsey, was in Washington, D.C. when Fort Sumter was fired upon, when the war broke out. And he immediately told Lincoln that Minnesota troops would come and serve. They volunteered for a 5-year tour of duty, and they were involved in several of the most important battles of the war. They were at First Bull Run, they were at Antietam, and most notably, they were at Gettysburg. And at Gettysburg, while they are outnumbered 5-1, they charge. And later, President Calvin Coolidge said about the 1st Minnesota and their commanding officer that Colonel Colville and those 8 companies of the 1st Minnesota are entitled to rank as the saviors of their country because of their actions at Gettysburg. Now, a fun fact about the 1st Minnesota is that at Gettysburg, they captured a Confederate battle flag. That battle flag is now on display at the Minnesota State Historical Society. And every so often, the state of Virginia contacts Minnesota and demands their battle flag back. And regardless of which political party is in power in Minnesota, regardless of if the governor is a Democrat or a Republican, the answer is always the same. If you want it, come and fight for it because you couldn't keep it the first time. Ulysses Grant was promoted in March 1864. He had done well in the West, for example, at Shiloh. He heads east and he leaves his colleague William Tecumseh Sherman with instructions to invade Georgia. This becomes a period of total war. In total war, it is no longer focused just on the enemy military. It is designed for total destruction. Among other things, prisoner of war exchanges stop during this time. William Tecumseh Sherman captures Atlanta. His quote at the time is, "I can make Georgia howl." His march to the sea in late 1864 from Atlanta to, I believe, to Savannah, but at least from Atlanta to the Atlantic Ocean. He and his army destroy everything in their wake. Crops, houses, whatever it is. This is what total war is. He then marches north to South Carolina. I mentioned before, reaction in Europe initially kind of tended to be pro-Southern for various reasons. The South, the Confederacy, had lots of hopes that someone was going to intervene on their behalf. Essentially, the Union victories at Antietam, at Gettysburg, and the Emancipation Proclamation all combined to keep Europe out of the war. Britain, importantly, though, did say that the Confederates weren't just rebels, that rather they had the status as a belligerent power, which gave them sort of more diplomatic rights than a rebellion would have. And so Britain, at times, came very close to intervening. Now, this helped Europe in other ways as well. For example, France decided to try to take control of Mexico during this time, which you can research if you're interested in that, because the U.S. was in no position to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. In 1864, there are three parties. There are the so-called radical Republicans. There are the Democrats, who are called Copperheads, and they're called Copperheads because they think they can't be trusted, like a copperhead snake. And then there is the so-called Union Party, which is a party that is designed sort of as a party to preserve the Union, which is Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. Radical Republicans were radical essentially because they really didn't like slavery, and they did not believe that the South should be let off scot-free when the war was over. So Fremont actually withdrew from the election because he was concerned that Lincoln would not be reelected. Lincoln was not a popular president. The war was still going on. Again, most deadliest days in U.S. history happening during this war. Lincoln was not a popular person. In 1863, there were draft riots in New York City. Not a popular war in the North. Lincoln was not, in his day, a popular president. However, luckily or unluckily for him, depending on how you look at history, Lincoln, by the time the election rolls around in November of 1864, easily wins re-election. So McClellan, the Copperhead. So Copperheads here these are Democrats who wanted basically peace with the South. Lincoln's running mate, Andrew Johnson, was also a Democrat, but he did not want peace with the South. And so McClellan only wins electoral votes in Kentucky, New Jersey, and Delaware. Lincoln wins everywhere else. You might notice on this map that there are two Confederate states with votes shown, Louisiana and Tennessee. These were states that at the time were under Union control. The Union Army had conquered those Confederate states, and military governors were put in place. In fact, Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's running mate, had been the military governor of Tennessee. Although people in those states did vote, their electoral votes did not count, and would not count until after the Civil War, when the states were what is known as reconstructed and officially rejoined the Union. So what we see is a very clear electoral victory for Lincoln. So the official end of the war is usually considered to be when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia on April 9th, 1865. However, there was continued fighting, I should say. The final Confederate troops didn't surrender until June 2nd, 1865 in Galveston. You may be increasingly familiar with the holiday Juneteenth, which celebrates the end of slavery in Texas. And again, this is not 100% accurate because slavery actually continued on in other places in the U.S. until the 13th Amendment was officially adopted. But it shows, among other things, that the Confederate troops actually still had control over parts of Texas well into June of 1865. But before that happened in June, Lincoln was assassinated. His assassination is honestly probably one of the things that has made him a mythic figure in American history. Because although he was also president during the Civil War, not all of his military decisions during the war were effective. There were other things he did that made him very a controversial figure. But the fact that he was assassinated certainly, I think, elevated him in the conscience of the country. So you might be familiar with this. John Wilkes Booth, a very prominent actor of his day, goes into the box at Ford Theater in Washington on the night of April 14th. So just shortly after Appomattox. Shoots Lincoln, yells "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always the tyrants, and runs away. He is captured several days later. Lincoln dies the next day. Lincoln is replaced with Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is a Southerner. Andrew Johnson is a Democrat, although he ran under the Union ticket with Lincoln. And although Lincoln wanted to essentially welcome the southern states back with open arms, he also wanted probably rights for African Americans in those states. Andrew Johnson did not really feel the same way. And we'll talk about that in our final days of the course when we talk about Reconstruction. So there we have the American Civil War. Again, lots of information out there. This was longer than I thought it was going to be. Also, I hope you found it useful. Thanks for watching.